Thank you. Well, I'm going to try putting this up on and hope that I'm loud enough and I make enough noise here for everybody. This is actually the first time I've done this program, and as I was putting it together, I realized, there's a lot more to do. My goals, I thought there were a few fun stories. I thought there were a few provocative items I would share. And as I said, I realized that there's a lot more that needs to be done in the history of this neighborhood, because the history of this neighborhood is so much related to the history of Kalamazoo. And let me see. Maybe I turned it off. Nope, I had it on. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to start at the beginning. And just for those of you who don't know much about Kalamazoo County history, we start getting settlers here in the 1820s. The county is actually organized in 1830, and the first part of land that we'll eventually know as the Stuart Neighborhood is kind of right here. And you'll notice that it is a Native American reserve. The land in Michigan had been settled when the Northwest Territory, the Treaty of 1795, stipulated how the land would be organized. And during that organization, some lands were set aside for educational purposes, some lands were set aside, as Native American reservations. This was a reserve that was for a Potawatomi band. Eventually, the Chicago Treaty of 1827 opens it up, and this land is made available for people to settle, for people of European, basically our typical, settlers, our pioneers, who would come in and they would buy land, and typically they would buy it at a land office. Titus Bronson, he's one of the earliest settlers in Kalamazoo County. He's here by 1829. We don't have any photos of Titus Bronson, but there are a couple of paintings that were done some years after, and this is a depiction of Titus Bronson. Initially, Kalamazoo was known as Bronson, but eventually the name would get changed, and that would be a program in and of itself about Bronson and the settling of Kalamazoo and some of Bronson's eccentricities. This is an 1834, it's a copy of a map showing the city of Kalamazoo. And I only show this because at this point it's still Bronson. We won't become Kalamazoo until 1835, Kalamazoo County. There's Main Street, it heads up toward east to the river. And it's going to be another 10 to 12 years before there's really any kind of settlement in what will be known as the Stuart Neighborhood. But just to give you a kind of a context, when Stuart is settled, when it's developed, and how it happens in the whole settlement of the city of Kalamazoo. I'm going to talk about 5 early residents, and I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 existing structures or houses that are associated with these residents. And I'm not going to talk about architectural history. If you want to learn the architectural history, there will be 2 opportunities, and Lynn Houghton will be doing a program next week at this time, and she'll be talking about the architectural history. And then later in June, as part of the WMU Archives Gazelle walking tours, she will be doing a walking tour of the neighborhood. So I'm really going to stay away from architectural history, but I will be showing you a couple of pictures of houses. This is probably the earliest house in the Stuart neighborhood. This is a house that presently is at the corner of Elmwood and Woodward Street. And it was probably built sometime in the 1830s, possibly the 1840s. We have lots of evidence that it was moved. It was in the area of, there's a church that for many, many years was Unity Church, and now it's a Church of Latter-day Saints. It's a university, kind of a branch church of the Latter-day Saints. And so it was in the vicinity of their parking lot. And we know that it was moved. We don't know exactly when it was moved, but when Frederick Woodward married for a second time, and Woodward married a woman named Trask. And Louisa Trask was a sister of Luther H. Trask. And we know that this house probably belonged to Luther Trask, possibly Frederick Woodward lived in there for a while, but the house gets moved, it gets moved to its present location, and eventually Frederick Woodward will put a house in its space. And that's a house that's no longer in existence. The best way to describe it would be the parking lot of what was formerly the Unity Church or the present-day Latter-day Saints Church. Interestingly enough, this house was also associated with members of the Bartholomew family. W.G. Bartholomew was a cabinet maker. He may also have been somehow related to the Woodwards, to the Trask. I'm still working on that. There's an article from the Kalamazoo Gazette in 1881 where they are talking about putting oil lamps at various corners in the neighborhood, and they actually reference the corner of Bartholomew Street and Woodward Avenue. So I think, we know it as Elmwood today, I think it actually had, an earlier, possibly a name, maybe an informal name, and at that point it may have been associated with the Bartholomew family who lived in the house. So Trask is an early resident, tied in with the Woodward family, and a little bit about Frederick Woodward. He came from the east, just like many of the people who initially came to Kalamazoo. He marries, his second wife is Louisa Trask, and he had been born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and actually was in Michigan by the 1830s. So he's a very, very early resident of Michigan and a fairly early resident of Kalamazoo. And in any case, active in the Presbyterian Church. He passes away in 1895, and his is the house that we don't have much documentation. It's no longer standing, but some of what I'm going to talk about are street names, and Woodward Avenue, of course, is named for Frederick Woodward. And this is an article that's, as I say, I think it's proof that that we know that the house was moved, and I finally found this article for the first time when I was looking for it earlier this week, but they talk about Woodward purchasing a tract of land with his wife's father, Aaron Trask, and that the house is now located at the corner of Elmwood Street and Woodward Avenue. So I'm going to get my notes all goofed up here. And that's an article from March 29th, 1881, a Gazette article. The next person I'm going to talk about is Amariah T. Prouty, and fortunately, his house is still standing. This is a view of the house early on. Prouty moves into, by 1850-52, when he builds the house, he moves into an area that is largely uninhabited. The Trask house is there, hasn't been moved yet, but he gets a large tract of land that would be between the Kalamazoo Avenue and West Main. And even before he builds his house, he starts an orchard business. And he's apparently extremely successful at that orchard business. He builds a house. He built a house in what would be the Gothic style. I have an illustration here from a book called Architecture of Country Houses. This was a book that was a plan book for houses that was put together by Andrew Jackson Downing. And Downing was famous for his advocacy of the Gothic style of house. He was also a horticulturalist. I'm sure, Prouty, being an orchard man himself, probably, felt like he had some connection. We actually have records in the archive. He probably built large portions of the house himself, but we have some of the contract work where he contracted certain parts out, windows, sashes. And so this is the house as it looked then. This house is now presently at the corner of Elm Street and Eleanor Street. It was probably moved there by the early 1880s when the neighborhood was developing. He was a fairly successful horticulturalist. For example, the 1860 census where they ask for information on your real estate holdings, the wealth, the value, your personal wealth. He identifies that he has $18,000 worth of real estate holdings, and I'm sure it includes the house and it includes the nursery lands that he owns, $2,000 worth of personal assets. There's a picture of his wife, Sophia Ransom Prouty. Ransom is another name. We'll talk a little bit about Ransom, but she is related, of course, to the Epaphroditus Ransom family. And in 1870, he indicates in the census, at that point he's 67 years old, that he has $50,000 worth of real estate and $2,000 worth of personal assets. And by the way, the Proudys had 13 children. I've never tracked, how many of them were actually in this house at any given time, but it's not a large house. I mean, I think it has about 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, and so you know that it was probably a bit compact and tight. The other thing, when I talk about Andrew Jackson Downing, he was another one of these people who had a plan. Not only did he have a plan for architecture, but he had a plan for how to live your life. And so in the Architecture of Country Houses and some of the other books that he produced, he said, you want to get a house that's a little bit removed from the industry of the day. It's going to be a better place for you to live. In fact, you should have an organ, and the woman of the household should play the organ, and you should sing, motivational music or hymns or songs. And we do know from inventories, probate inventories, they did have an organ in that house. Now, I don't know if Mrs. Prouty was, singing hymns, playing the organ and singing hymns, but to some degree, I think he must have bought into Andrew Jackson Downing's idea of what constituted, a country home. So, and I have just an advertisement advertising the fruit and ornamental trees that he had available. And I mean, it's staggering. He had 150 varieties of apples, 110 of the pear, 47 of the peach, grapes, raspberries, currants. So, he had quite a bit to offer, and apparently he made quite a bit of wealth in that business venture. And you see him frequently advertising not only in the area newspapers, but the Michigan Farmer and other regionally produced publications. So this next slide talks about a man who was eminently successful in all of his business ventures. He was engaged for some 20 years in the management of the largest general store in the village, and then he engaged in banking and other enterprises. He built several buildings in the city, among them the one now occupied by Mr. S.A.B. Brown on Stuart Avenue. In 1859, he purchased the farm known as Brookside, 2 miles north of the city. Who am I talking about? Whose house am I talking about? No. Well, I'm not talking about Charles Stuart. I'm actually talking about Hiram Arnold. And this is one of those kind of neighborhood stories. It's been passed down for such a long time that when we look at the Stuart house, and this is a 1909 view of the Stuart house, this is Stuart as a young man, Stuart is a much older man. We have the story in the neighborhood, and it's a great story because we know that he was there by 1859, but it was actually built by a man named Hiram Arnold, and who was a very successful businessman. He builds the house in 1854. There's some speculation that maybe he felt that even in the 1850s that neighborhood was going to go around him, but he soon moves, 4 short years later, moves 2 miles north of Kalamazoo. He was involved in many business ventures, and I don't have a picture of Hiram Arnold, but his house is forever now known as the Stuart House. So who was Charles Stuart? Well, he was a senator in the state, 1852 to 58. He was, most certainly, he hosted presidential candidate Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas stayed on Stuart Avenue. We can be fairly certain of that. He would live in this house until 1883. It's reputed that this house had the first indoor plumbing installed after it was built. And Stuart himself came from New York, as did many of our early Kalamazoo pioneers. He was born in 1810. He settles in Kalamazoo in 1835. And Unfortunately, he passes away in 1887, and he doesn't live in the Stuart house for the last several years of his life. Maybe it's too big. He apparently suffered from rheumatism and had pretty ill health for the last decade or so of his life, but as many sources said, he never lost his interest in public affairs. So, what were some of his interests in public affairs? Well, one was the Kalamazoo case. And the Kalamazoo case, of course, is a famous case. There's a historical marker by the third school in its site. This is the first school that was there in the location of West Nidge Avenue, the Union School. And the Kalamazoo case essentially dealt with the whole topic, should people pay taxes to support high schools? And there were several wealthy businessmen, Charles Stuart among them, who brought a case and said, along with people like Theodore Sheldon and others who said, no, the normal education is, up through the 8th grade. Anything beyond that, it should be the family's responsibility. And in any case, the courts decided in the favor of funding high school public education. And as a Democrat, I think, it's interesting to think about the Democrats and the Republicans, and because the Republican Party probably in the 1860s would have been seen in somewhat more progressive terms, and the Democratic Party maybe less so. And Hiram Arnold, along with Charles Stuart, were both pretty well involved in the Democratic Party. So we know that he comes down on the side of the Kalamazoo case against supporting high school education. We also know that Stephen Douglas is a very, very good friend of his. And getting back to your American history classes, of course, Stephen Douglas was a politician from Illinois, a Democrat. And of course, political campaigns were waged much differently in the 1850s and 1860s, but I've heard some people say that if they had had campaign managers in the sense that we know campaign managers today, that Charles Stuart was certainly Stephen Douglas's campaign manager. And in fact, Charles Stuart thought so much of his political colleague, Stephen Douglas, that he saw to it that there would be a street named in Kalamazoo for his political colleague, and Douglas Avenue is named for Stephen Douglas. Of course, Stephen Douglas ultimately, he is not elected president. The Democratic Party changes, the Republican Party moves to the forefront, and but in any case, it's a very interesting connection with national politics that we can take right to the Stuart Neighborhood and literally look at this friendship between two Democratic politicians of the 1850s. So this is a reference to what I have found some of the first village lots being for sale. And this is Luther Trask. This is from the Kalamazoo Gazette, and he talks about 25 choice village lots on Woodward Avenue and Elm Street will be sold at very low figures and terms made easily. This is 1872, and this is literally just on the brink of streetcars. And in fact, I was talking to my friend and neighbor Karen Lays the other night, and she said, well, maybe we could say that the Stuart Neighborhood came about because of mass transit. And I think she's right, because we had these few scattered houses. It was still quite a walk into Kalamazoo, or most likely these people had horses and carriages, and they had the land to support the upkeep of horses. But it really was first the horse-drawn streetcars and later the electric streetcars that really opened up the Stuart Neighborhood as a middle and upper middle class neighborhood. So this is a stereopticon view. Actually, this is one that came in. We just acquired the Kalamazoo Gazette photo morgue and clipping files, and I believe this was one that came out of the Kalamazoo Gazette photo morgue, and this is a stereopticon view. We have a lot of people in this audience who probably remember Viewmasters. This is an early version of the Viewmaster. You would put it on this device and you would get a 3D effect, and this is of course showing streetcars operating in downtown Kalamazoo. I have a couple of just very quick views. These are from a publication from 1909 called Picturesque Kalamazoo, and they are not very good views, but this is Woodward Avenue from Main Street and Seward Avenue from Main Street. There are some postcard views. One of the things I have found in my work that it's oftentimes a request, somebody wants a picture of their house, and the pictures of the houses are very few and far between. We have a lot of real estate listing cards from the 1950s and 60s. So you do get some of the information, or at least older views of the houses from those real estate listing cards. But anyway, in 1909, Picturesque Kalamazoo showed a couple of the most fashionable neighborhoods. At that point, Stuart was a fashionable neighborhood. West Main Hill just starting to open up, but there are lots and lots of views of Woodward, Stuart, and I just show, because I'm not going to talk about architecture, just the entryways into these streets. So this gives you a little more sense of maybe the growth and the density. This is an 1874 bird's eye view map, and in fact, let's see, that's Main Street right there. That is Kalamazoo Avenue. That's Elm Street. There's the train, which is currently part of the Calhaven Trail. And the one thing about the 74 and the 83 bird's eye view map, and I'll show you a clip from the 83 shortly, they tend to cut off right about the second block of Woodward and even into the first block of Stewart Avenue. But if you do look at these, and for some buildings, for some structures, these bird's eye view maps are literally the only visual evidence we have. But you do see the Prouty House just kind of sitting there in the middle of, at that point, the orchard. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this area a little bit later. This is an 1874. I take the plat maps and I've split the north and the south. And again, I had said I wanted to talk a little bit about street names, some of the street names that are named for people in the neighborhood, some that run through the neighborhood but are not named for individuals in the neighborhood. This is the Grand Rapids Road. It literally is the road to Grand Rapids. It's now North Street. So I think that's kind of interesting, to look at. There's a street over here called Ransom Street. That street is still there. There's a street here called Summer Street. And is Summer Street in the Stuart neighborhood? No. Summer Street is actually off, Summer Street is actually kind of off into the West Douglas or the Douglas neighborhood. But we have a Willard Street down here. And between 1874 and 1890, eventually, there's a whole big, and reading the newspapers, there's this block of land, and there's a person that isn't going to sell this block of land, and they aren't going to let the street run through, and eventually a deal is made, and Willard Street runs through, and then that becomes Willard Street, and Summer Street gets the name in the West Douglas neighborhood. So Ransom, of course, is named for Epaphroditus Ransom. And Epaphroditus Ransom was the only governor of Michigan to ever come from Kalamazoo. He was a justice of the Supreme Court. He was a justice of the Supreme Court from 1836 to 1847, governor of Michigan, 1848 to 1850. His list of distinguished service accomplishments, go on and on and on. He came from Massachusetts. In 1834, he comes to Michigan, so he becomes pretty active early on, and it's pretty clear to me that when Ransom came to Michigan, he also brought some wealth with him. He, at one point, was involved in law profession, himself practicing with Charles Stuart. So you see all these interesting ties, all these interesting neighborhood connections. So a little bit about Epaphroditus Ransom. Now, Willard here, that is named for probably a person who is lesser known in Kalamazoo history. His name is Isaac Willard, and he comes to Michigan in the 1820s, and he is in Kalamazoo as early as 1833. He will serve as postmaster. He will also be involved in the Constitutional Convention of 1850. Again, born in Worcester County, Massachusetts. So he was politically a Democrat too. So you can assume that all of these guys probably, interacted with one another, worked together on a regular basis. This is the second half of that plat map, and some of the streets here are going to be a little more familiar. Let's see, we've got Kalamazoo Avenue up here, we've got Main, that would be Elm Street, and of course Woodward, Stuart, and we have the Mountain Home Cemetery. So not much change there, except that not nearly as built up. If you look at these plat maps, generally these will represent, these are outlines of houses, and they will represent the built environment in the neighborhood. So again, I guess as I was putting this together, I thought, okay, there are these founding people, these early people. They have, in some instances, buildings named for them. In some instances, their legacy is known only through street names. And then there are neighborhood institutions. And when I think of neighborhood institutions, the first one that I always will think of is a school. And this is the first school that stood approximately in the area where the Woodward School is today, except it had more of a presence on Woodward. And if I had a good map, I could show you that. The Woodward School that's there now is the second one on the site. That would be built in 1930, and that's one of the older schools now in the Kalamazoo public school system. I actually went to a school on the east side of Kalamazoo, Woodrow Wilson School, that I think was built about the same time Woodward School is, and every time I go in Woodward School it reminds me of Wilson School. And of course Wilson School is gone now, and so is this school, but it's been replaced by the present day Woodward School, which when it was built in 1930, they changed the facing to Stuart Avenue, because at that point, Stuart Avenue, as I said, would be a very prestigious address to have in the community. The other institutions I think about that sometimes will bind a neighborhood together, churches. And I have some churches here that are the same, are different. Actually, this is not quite fair. Maybe I shouldn't have that church there. That is St. A's Church. And that church was built in the 1950s. And I will show you in a few minutes what that church replaced. But that is a relatively new church, relatively speaking. There actually is a church on North Street, the True Holiness Unto the Lord Church, which would be the newest church in the neighborhood. And it's a church that's in, it's a very plain building. I think even some of it is pole construction. So that is our newest church as far as physical structure goes. But the original St. Augustine's Church, St. A's Church, was actually on Kalamazoo Avenue, and it was over in the vicinity. There's Kalamazoo County Mental Health there now. So, but St. A's has been a part of our neighborhood and close to our neighborhood for a very, very long time. Probably our oldest neighborhood church. At this point, it's called the Simpson Methodist Episcopal Church. Later on, it will be the Simpson Methodist Church. This church eventually closes, and the congregation of this church will merge with the Westwood United Methodist Church. Today, it's still used as a church, and it's Allen Chapel AME, and it's an African American church. Just as the True Holiness Unto the Lord Church, I don't think any church ever likes to pigeonhole themselves into, well, we are, African American, or we're Caucasian, but with primarily African American parishioners. So that church is still there. It just is a different denomination. Two churches that came along in the 1930s. What's that?
What's the location of that church, lady?
This church here? That is still there. It's on North Street. As you drive to the end of Elm Street, you almost dead end into it. Yeah. Whoops. So yeah, you almost dead end into it. And in fact, this house also had a house for the minister. And some years ago, we had that on tour, and it's in, I want to say it's in like the 500 block of Douglas. And so they had a minister's house that was about 3-4 blocks away. And that, I think, became separated from the church property, though, many, many, many years ago. So this church here is today Latter-day Saints, and they have a university and collegiate outreach. For many, many years, this was Unity, and this was actually built originally as a Christian Science church. Back in the 30s, when the Christian Science church in downtown Kalamazoo was literally busting at the seams, a group of younger families petitioned and got permission to build a new church, and they built it in what would be a New England church style. And this church has been widely photographed, it's on calendars, and this was the church for the Christian Scientists for many years. I have not been in this church since Unity left, but when Unity was at that site, you would still go into the main sanctuary, and they had, words, sayings of Mary Baker Eddy, who is a leader in the Christian Science church. And I don't know if the Latter-day Saints, if they've kept that or if they've, changed it. But
I was there 2 years ago.
Okay.
For a ring ceremony, and they didn't have any of that up.
so they probably, and all of these buildings over time have been modified, have been altered. I remember before Unity had this very large, handicap ramp in the front of it. So they probably painted over. And in any case, I can say that Unity and now Latter-day Saints, they have taken a real interest in our neighborhood activities, and they have been involved in some of our holiday parties and some of our gatherings over at the Stuart Avenue Inn. So they've been very good neighbors over the years. Whoops. This is a rendering of a church that was built in 1937. It was Calvary Church, and you could literally drive by this and almost miss it.
Hey.
It's kind of a small, nondescript building, and Calvary was there for many years. It's at the corner of Kalamazoo Avenue in Greenwich.
Oh.
Yeah, and does anybody know where Calvary is today? Drake Road. They are a huge church. Now they are the church that I think until they put up a parking light in that traffic light, you literally, if you drove over there on Sundays, they had somebody directing traffic. They still do, okay. So anyway, they had moved from a small site, I think over on Pine Street. They built this church. They were here for some years, and then eventually they sold it to another church, a Baptist church. In the last 10 years, it has been a school, and more recently, and I think a permanent use for this building is it's home to a title company. And this is actually one of the buildings that we are going to have on tour during our Stuart Neighborhood 40th anniversary tour, because they have not altered the inside, they've not altered the sanctuary. In fact, this title company, they are involved in tax sales, and they've had some tax sales, and literally you sit in the sanctuary when you go to the tax sale. So in any case, these are some of the churches that have been in our neighborhood historically, some of which are, operating under different denominations or operating under different uses. One thing that I have kind of dealt with and thought about for a long, long time is the whole use of houses as rental property and as non-residential property in our neighborhood. And I still am not sure that I've totally wrapped my head around this one. This is an interesting article about a house that was known as the Pengaley home. This is not the Pengaley house. The Pengaley house at 430 Elm Street will be on tour on September 28th, because it's the house where Tom Dietz and I live. Yeah. And that's the Pengaley house. This is the Pengaley home. And Mary Pengaley was a fervent prohibitionist, temperance advocate, did not believe in alcohol. She was head of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they eventually acquired this house at 308 Woodward, and they call it the Pengaley home. And they get this house somewhere around 1911, 1912. They have it for several years in the teens. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what they were doing with this house, because they used it as their club headquarters. They had meetings, they had club activities. But what they are talking about here is they are talking about a new Pengali house that was at West Water and Cooley Street that would eventually replace the Pengali house on Woodward Avenue. And I switched my slides around here, sorry about that. This is where they're trying to figure out what do they do with this house on Woodward Avenue. It's good for their meetings, but they say that it's problematic because some of the members feel that the Pengali home is too far out to accomplish the work desired and needed, and that the WCTU ought to have a place downtown that is easily accessible to everyone, especially those whom the society would like to reach. So my real question, and I don't know that I'll ever get at the bottom of this, were they operating some type of house where, women, girls who, were having difficulties could go to? Was it some type of shelter? Was it some type of shelter? I've looked at the temperance records, and there's some evidence that they are really interested in helping wives of men who have alcohol abuse problems. Were they trying to help some of the wives of men who, literally sometimes would drink the paycheck away and leave the wife and leave the children, with nothing to survive on? And I don't know if they were operating in that means out of this house at 308 Woodward or not. I do know that they get this building at West Water and Cooley Street, and of course, historically, the main police station was very close to that location, and maybe they were, trying to work in, some consort with police in relationship to, women finding themselves, ravaged by alcohol problems in their homes. I don't know. So what I do know is this house belonged to, after the WCTU moves out, a family named Hill live in this house, and they are running it as a boarding house in the later teens and into the 20s. And this is a picture that talks about Hill's, a popular Woodward Avenue rooming house. They had a clientele almost exclusively of Western Michigan University faculty. And so this is an article from an alumni magazine, kind of a looking back article from the 50s, talking about these two boarding houses that catered to faculty. One was in the Vine neighborhood. That one had been torn down, had become a parking lot by the 50s. This one was still there. This one, of course, was considered the better because the food was better, the accommodations were better. I don't know, but this is a contemporary view of that house. It still stands there. And without looking at the floor plan, it is a fairly large house. I know that the Hill family lived there while they operated the boarding house, or the rooming house, I should say, and that, the Mrs. Hill, and presumably she had teenage daughters who eventually, married, moved out, that presumably, they were probably cooking and serving those people. So that made me think a little bit more about, the history of rental property in the neighborhood. And I have just a few examples through the years, of rental advertisements in the neighborhood. And I found it rather interesting. The prices are interesting and how they are being marketed. This is actually Lawrence N. Burke, and this is an advertisement from 1893. He lived at 208 Stuart. Now, I know a little bit about the Burke family, and the reason why he really wants to get this house sold. In fact, he is not only willing to sell the house, he will rent it. At that point, he is married to his first wife. She has consumption, tuberculosis, a common ailment of the day. They go out west for a couple of years hoping that she's cured. Unfortunately, she isn't cured. They sell the house, they move back to Kalamazoo, but they move into the Vine neighborhood. Although he spends a little bit of time, he meets his second wife and he lives on Eleanor Street for a while, but that's a whole other story. He lives next to this 10-room house at 708 Eleanor. This is an advertisement from 1908. It has all the modern conveniences, $18 per month. And for rent, a newly decorated house with a large lot. It's a block from school, Woodward School, and it's near the car line. There again, that public transportation. 819 Elmwood, and have a phone number to call. And then Mitchell Place, a well-heated and nicely furnished room in a new and modern home, private family, rent reasonable, 413 Mitchell Place, intersecting West Kalamazoo Avenue in the 700 block. So it's not nearly, as prevalent as it is today, but over the years, you do find rental advertisements, and over time, some of these buildings, these houses will be subdivided even more. And I'm not going to fast forward to 1973 yet, but talk about that here shortly. So the other thing that I've thought a lot about the neighborhood, and the whole time I've lived there, is the whole stress between business and residential areas. And this is an article from the Kalamazoo Gazette from January 10th, 1890, and it's talking about problems over on Greenwich Place. They've got freight cars which are allowed to stand across the street and a bumping post. There's somebody named Conrad Miller who they want them to remove a certain building from the street, and they're petitioning, requesting that the railroad company build a crossing over the street at that point. So I think that stress between, and of course this is a railroad, this is a fairly small street, kind of on the eastern edge of the neighborhood, but a group of neighbors petitioned the city council trying to get some action, and that's something that we still do today in the Stuart neighborhood. There are problems, our executive director or our board or just private residents go to the city council and petition. So I'd mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about how some of the areas of the neighborhood have been marketed. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that the newest portion of the neighborhood is the far eastern portion of the neighborhood. It's the Allen Boulevard Old Orchard neighborhood. And today, when you go down Allen Boulevard, and actually I'm the newsletter carrier for Allen Boulevard and Old Orchard. I've been doing this for a couple of months again. And it is a very congested place. This area was developed turn of the last century, but it's clear that the initial intentions of this area were much, much more grandiose than what the area has evolved into. So they're talking about Allen Boulevard, a beauty spot. They are offering 40-foot lots for $1,200 each. Now, you could, for $1,200, you probably could have bought most of a house in other parts of Kalamazoo. So this Allen Boulevard in particular, there are lots and lots of articles about it. They're talking about the fine cement boulevard. There's a reference to a fountain that was on this street, sidewalks, everything you could want and within walking distance of downtown. Because of course in 1903, when this area is being platted, being developed, the automobile it's a known entity, but it's still pretty far off in most people's imaginations. But this is actually one of the houses that's still there. It's behind St. Augustine's Church, and that's actually a postcard view. So this is one of the, we don't have postcards for every house in the neighborhood, but that one we surprisingly do have. I'd mentioned that I was going to talk about what St. Augustine's replaced. And St. Augustine's and some of the buildings and some of the structures along there replaced an area that was known for many, many years as Mansion Row. And of course, if you're going to plat out a grand boulevard, you might as well name it for yourself. And so Oscar M. Allen did name it for himself. Allen was probably best known for, he had the Globe Casket Company, but he was also involved in real estate interest, banking interest. If you ever take a tour around Mountain Home Cemetery, look for his tombstone. It's on the eastern edge of the cemetery, and it's a very large granite globe. Globe Construction Company, that was his company. So this house would eventually be taken down. There were several more that were of this caliber. This is the next new downtown plat, Old Orchard. They have cement streets and walks, sewer, gas, water, all possible conveniences. A number of lots will be offered for $850. And this is from June 20th, 1909. So, and one of the last areas, I guess, developed about the same period, no, a little bit earlier, sorry. This is 1903. This is reference to Elm Place. Elm Place. Elm Place is still there. There's about one house on Elm Place that's right behind. There's a t-shirt and graphic screen printing shop, and Elm Place is behind that. In fact, that shop there is really the last surviving house on Mansion Row. But this talks about an attractive plat soon open to the public. It's west of Allen Court, north of the Arcadia Creek. And they talk about a street 33 feet wide will be running from Elm Street over to the Michigan Central Railroad, cement walks, property graded. It talks about the fact that it's going to be an area that was formerly known as the Old Bennett Pond. And I'd shown you the 1874 map. Here's the 1883 bird's eye view map. Not much better depiction of Stewart Avenue, I'm afraid. But there's Main, there's Elm. This is Bennett's Pond, right in there. And that is approximately sort of behind where Comensoli's restaurant is. So that was Bennett's Pond, and that eventually would be drained. And then, the Elm Place would literally run all the way through. Doesn't look like that today, but I'll soon be getting to that. So I'm sort of winding down here, moving toward our contemporary, the 1970s, and the formation of the Stewart Area Restoration Association. But I've got a little goodie here that a friend shared with me last summer, and I didn't save my link. Unfortunately, Lynn Houghton did, as did Sharon Ferraro. This is a 1937, it's basically a redlining map, and I'll show you it's a residential security map. It's from the Division of Research and Statistics, Homeowners Loan Corporation, 1937. And what you'll notice is it has grades for the properties in the city of Kalamazoo. So we have green as the first grade, blue the second, yellow the third, pink the fourth. And when you go back and you look at the Stuart Neighborhood, which is C5, at that point, inexplicably, I'll say that over again, but we are grade 3. And I think what we have happening by this point in time, we have a lot of roads, major roads that are getting larger that are going through. We always traditionally had railroads cutting through the neighborhood. We had primarily wood frame construction. Even though our neighborhood has had development from, until a year ago, I could say from 1840s to 1940s, because our newest house had been built in the 40s, but now we have 2 new houses that were built in 2012. We had a lot of older construction that was pre-1900. And these programs, I'm not a historian of this time period, but this all factored into the types of loans that were made, decisions that were made about planning and zoning. And I wonder what kind of ramifications this had, and maybe if some of the problems we perceived by the 1960s and 70s can go back to this time, but also bring in some of these other factors. I don't know. As I said, when I worked on this project, I realized there's a lot more to work on. So we have the whole redlining issue and the fact that we are given a 3rd grade out of 4 grades. And it's very interesting if you look at the first and the second are these greens and these blues. These are stretching into the hinterlands, the outskirts. Further out. These are clearly those newer developments. Going toward West Nitch Hill, going toward the west side of Kalamazoo. And it's very interesting to see, the areas that are in pink, some of what would be the traditional north side, and then some areas sort of east side near some very, big industrial areas. So anyway, I think one problem that happens after this period, and one that I as a resident have dealt with, happens in the 1960s. Maybe somehow connected to this redlining, maybe not sure. But in the 1960s, I-94, 131, they are expanding, they're building, and we're having all of these local expressways, business loops that are coming in. And this is an article from the Gazette from 1960, and it's talking about proposed one-way streets, proposed highway throughways, and this shows what will become Michical. And this literally separates the east and the west side of our neighborhood. This is Michical, this is Kalamazoo Avenue, this is Main Street here. So, this is kind of the heart of the Stuart neighborhood, and this area over here is that area that I called the Allen Boulevard area, the Old Orchard area, that's kind of behind St. A's Church, and that literally splits it off from the rest of the neighborhood. And as a neighborhood organization, we fought to get that at least integrated back in with the neighborhood and to get it as part of the historic district to further integrate it in the neighborhood. So that article is from 1960. Now let's just say in 1964, in the spring, just before this construction began, the people didn't go easily. There were 13 parcels of land and they were refusing to be part of it. There were 48 parcels altogether. I mean, there were lots and lots of houses, lots of people, lots of families displaced. And in the end, 35 parcels at the time of this article from April of 64 had cost $510,000, well, actually almost $511,000, and they figured total land acquisition would be about $600,000. And eventually they did get all of their land. So enter in the Stuart Area Restoration Association, and we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. The Stuart Area Restoration Association forms in October of 1973 with the goal of protecting houses from further deterioration, making the neighborhood a better place to live. When community development block grant funds became available in 1980, we had our first office, we had our first executive director, we started having our first newsletters. This is a newsletter from that time period. I'll talk a little bit about preservation, but this is Mr. and Mrs. Lou and Annette Conti, talking to the association. There's just a reference, this is 1980, and board members recently hired Leslie Decker as the neighborhood administrator. And Leslie Decker's here tonight. Why don't you raise your hand, Leslie? And the organization embarked on a lot of things. Before the community development block grant funding, a good portion of the neighborhood had become historic, and this is the installation of a historic marker. But the association did not get enough of the neighborhood designated historic before buildings and before houses were lost. And this was a house that was next to a business on Kalamazoo Avenue called Rourke Brothers. And at this point, the association was behind the effort to get this part of the neighborhood designated historic. They didn't get to it in time. And my understanding was this house came down and it ultimately gave Mr. Rourke a right-of-way to property he owned behind his business and gave him a vacant lot next to it. So the interesting thing is this, in the same article, they're quoting, Lou Conti, and it's going to cost him $30,000 to fix this house up. And I think, so anyway. The association has been involved in zoning and rezoning, and we continue to be involved in those kinds of efforts. And of course, we always are involved in improvement efforts, and I think there's a group tonight that they are out gardening, but here we have, I don't know if I should out you, Leslie, but I believe that's you. Jean Bright. I didn't know these two individuals, they're referenced, but this is an article from the Gazette, and then youngsters pitching in at the schoolyard from 1982 with some neighborhood children. So, we take all kinds of volunteers. So, in closing, we're in our 40th year as a neighborhood association. We have many events planned, including we're having a historic homes tour. There's information on the table out there. It'll be September 28th. We also will be having neighborhood yard sales. Lynn Houghton will be doing her walking tour on June 27th. As I was saying to people as we came in, it was really a matter of what do I limit, what do I focus on? And somebody suggested I talk about Madeline Stockwell Turner. So Madeline Stockwell Turner, who is she? She lived in her neighborhood. She's the first woman in Michigan or anywhere to graduate from the University of Michigan. But she can also be placed along others like Lita Snow, who first lived on Elm Street, then later moved on to Allen Boulevard. And she founded the American Symphony Orchestra League in 1942. She helped found the Kalamazoo Symphony. Politicians like Howard Wolpe, Charles Stewart, Julius Burroughs, or even Japanese writers, and I've heard this man referred to as the Japanese Hemingway, Nagai Kofu, who lived in our neighborhood in 1905 when he was a student studying at Kalamazoo College. So more programs to do, more things to do. At this point, I will entertain any questions that anybody has. Well, nobody left. That's a good sign.
You did such a good job.
Yeah.
State hospital, Sharon, was it ever considered, I have read somewhere that at one time it was considered to be an early site.
I have read that too, and I think it was some land that Charles Stewart owned. And Tom, you've done a little more research here. You're not going to get out of here without answering a few questions.
What was it?
The state hospital, that grounds for the state hospital initially
The most
considered.
recent clipping in the Gazette that I found says that the land that was originally designated would be on the beautiful rise at the western end of the city looking down on the village. And the only rise at the western end of the Stuart Neighborhood, out along Main Street, would be leading up to the cemetery along the West Main Hill. That it said it's on the east side of that rise, looking down on the village.
So Douglas Avenue conceivably could have been the far eastern edge of that.
Yeah, would
Yeah.
go from Douglas Avenue on up the hill, according to that article in the Gazette, which dates from about 1851, 52. They decide that that's too close to town, and they need to move it out to the country. So they moved it a couple miles out of town. And the interesting thing is that the city had promised money and land in order to get this state hospital. And they put that up. But then when they decided that that land, and I think the reason they decided it was a bad place, my thinking is, you've got the state hospital, you've got people with some mental health issues, do you want them out the backyard having a big cemetery? Because the cemetery was there already. Mountain Home is 1849, and this would have been built in the 1850s. So I'm not sure they wanted the cemetery in their backyard. So they bought land, I forget how many acres it is, where the hospital is today, from Charles Stewart, who was the man who recommended that the state government take Kalamazoo's offer. And he made that recommendation to his law partner, the governor, Epaphroditus Ransom. So,
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Three houses that had Elm Place addresses in back of the print shop. The house that faces the north actually was on Creek Street, but I think it got too complicated to have one house, and then they cut it off and put together, but there was a street that was
Called Creek Street.
Creek Street.
And I remember that. I don't.
Got torn down when they put in Michigan.
Yeah. And I had forgotten all about Creek Street because, yeah, we had all of these little streets, and and I think, again, Leslie, I'm going to pick on you. Did you tell me that either you or Fred lived in one of those houses that got torn down, like, shortly?
I did as a student.
Okay.
On Allen Boulevard.
Yeah.
On farther down, or Rendell.
Yeah. And if you go onto Eleanor Street, the 700 block of Eleanor Street, it's a short, almost like a Court Street, but it's wider than a Court Street. When you get to the end of that street, I mean, you can literally see, where they just kind of cut the street off. And then at the other end, that picks up on the other side of Michical, there's the, continuation of Eleanor Street. And the reason I'm fixated on Eleanor Street, I lived there for the first, 11 years I lived in the neighborhood. But getting a repair person there in the days before cell phones, even sometimes if you called a police officer and they were fairly new, they would be saying, well, I'm driving up and down Eleanor Street, and there's not a 700 block. Yeah.
but the reason Eleanor is split has nothing to do with Michigan. That it was split a long time ago, and there are a number of newspaper articles, I can't remember the exact year, talking about building an extension of Eleanor Street across the railroad. And it gets all tangled up in, I can't remember just what program, what project I was working on, but I kept reading those stories long before Michigan.
Well, and then there's a park there too. because there's that park, there's that book on Kalamazoo parks, and there's an Eleanor Street Park that is
I think
somewhere.
they're
yeah.
trying to
Get the two-
We'll build a road across there connecting Eleanor Street if you'll give us some land for the development project. And this thing is in city council minutes, it's before the commission.
Well, and it's interesting, I'd mentioned the whole coming through of Willard Street, and that one keeps going back to the commission time, or the council time and time and time again, because there's a property owner there, and they have a fairly large piece of property, and they are just not going to let that, be opened. And the other piece, and eventually they do get it opened, but the other piece that I've heard is that, at one point there was possible, they were looking at even extending it a little bit further, but yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting stories. I mean, the streets for whom they're named, some of the political battles behind them, and of course today with Michical and the Elm Street crossover, I was going through some neighborhood files and found there was a point in the 1980s, early 90s, where we were standing there reading license plate numbers, and we were trying to document, who were people using it as a cut through? Did we stand a chance to get some of this corrected, since we were really trying to restore, more of the residential past, and yeah, some of these decisions that were made, decades ago, they come to haunt us today. Yeah.
Where are the new houses built last year?
They are in Willard Street, and they are in the 700 block of Willard Street. It was a project by the Kalamazoo County Land Bank. They are craftsmen. They kind of mimic a craftsman style, and literally in the last 3 months, they were on the market for about a year, and several of us were very concerned, would they ever, get owner occupants, because that's what the intention was. But literally in the last 3 months, they have both been purchased and people have moved in. So we finally, for the first time, I've lived at the corner of Willard and Elm since 1997. And there were 2 houses that were pretty deteriorated in that spot. And that again was a major struggle we had as a neighborhood association. But for the first time in all that time, I have neighbors behind me. And they're very nice houses. And so far, we're real happy with the outcome. It was difficult getting to it. Yes?
Sharon, one of the things that struck me when I first moved to Stuart is how some of the lots are huge and there's lots of land around each of the homes, and others are totally shoehorned in. Could you speak a little bit to why do you think that?
Well, one thing that I thought about that I decided not to talk about, but I will now, is that the neighborhood has been built and rebuilt over time. And so a really striking example of that can be found at the intersection of Kalamazoo Avenue and Elm Street. There are at least four of the most, until we got those houses on Willard Street, 4 of the most modern houses in the whole neighborhood. They are of that, kind of craftsman. They've got stucco siding. They've got, they clearly are from that time frame, 1900 to 1910 or 1915. But if you look at the old bird's eye view maps, there were houses there before. And I've not told you how I get at this newspaper stuff, but we have this product called America's Historical Newspapers. And it's an electronic product. Anybody who wants to come up to the archives, I'll show it to you. You can go through it. I've tried to find more information about houses being moved, houses being demolished, and I probably will try and find more of that as time goes on. So I don't know if those houses burned and were replaced, if they were moved and replaced. I've had questions about several of them. The Chapel House on Stuart Avenue, the house next to the B&B, that was built about 1910. But if you look at a bird's eye view map and you look at flat maps, it's clear there was an earlier house there. And what happened to it, why it went down, I don't know. And there's plenty of research to do, for a good long time. And then the other thing that happened, Kalamazoo has a population boom. Kalamazoo was never a boom town in the way you think of like some communities like Detroit, where all of a sudden the population explodes. But between 1900 and 1910, the paper mills are going at full tilt. You know, a lot of other things are going on, and the population, you know, grows quite a bit. And you find in, you know, the south side starts to grow about that time frame, but you find in some neighborhoods like Stuart and Vine where some people would sell off their backyards and through these little real estate developments, and I call them court streets. Sometimes they're known as alley housing. And you find that there are some professional real estate developers who are involved in this, and then you find that there are sometimes individuals. There's one court in the Vine neighborhood, I think it's called Duffield Court. I've been able to link that to a woman who I don't know for what reason, but you know, she manages to convince all of her neighbors to sell their backyards, and you know, she gets this little court street laid out and gets houses, you know, and they're very tight. And of course in 1900, 1905, it's still primarily, it's a walking city, it's a streetcar city. A lot of people right downtown don't have horses. And what kills some of that congestion is when suddenly every family has a car. And then by the 50s or 60s, a family with, you know, 2 adults, they might even have 2 cars. And, you know, so it's the car city, the automotive run city that, you know, really causes congestion and problems in some of these tight areas. It's, well, anyway, I go on.
It's interesting, the selling off of the backyards, because that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And that's exactly-
Oh, I'm sure that's what happened, you know, I'm sure to some degree Mitchell Place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 2 houses in Mitchell.
And, you know, the impact of having Western Michigan University and even Kalamazoo College, years ago I remember going through a scrapbook, and I wish I would have recorded what it was, but you know, somebody on Mitchell Place is helping, you know, helping the returning GIs who are here on the GI Bill, and it's somebody on Mitchell Place, and they've basically refurbished their 3rd floor attic, and they've got 3 beds, and they're renting them. You know, they're living in the house, they're renting them to 3 guys who are going to Western. You know, but probably the next person, and by the time you get to the 70s and the regulations for off-campus housing are relaxed, that's where you're going to have 5 students, and every one of them is going to have a car, and every one of their significant others is going to have a car. And then you get problems. So this was supposed to be a history and not a political rant. So any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.